Hi, and welcome to my podcast For You Before Two, encouraging young people to think about themselves, the you, before entering into a serious relationship or having a baby, the two. We are a charity that is all about education, and this podcast is hopefully no different. Join me as I talk to independent experts and enthusiasts in their field. My name is Becky Foljambe, née Parker, and all its nosiness. Hello, my name's Rebecca Foljambe. I am founder of You Before Two, and I am delighted to have Claire Houston with me today to talk about eating disorders. The title of our podcast today is Eating Disorders, They Are Not About Food, and hopefully we'll dispel some myths talking to our expert Claire about this. So just before we introduce Claire, I just want to introduce you to some statistics about eating disorders. The scale of the problem is huge. The charity BEAT estimates that 1.25 million people in the UK suffer from an eating disorder. We don't know how many exactly because many won't have come forward or recognise their own illness. And eating disorders impact an estimated 5 million when family, friends, colleagues and others are taken into account. Eating disorders cost the economy a staggering £16.8 billion per year, including a £4.6 billion cost to the NHS. Those are really startling statistics, Claire. I will get on to that, but firstly, would you kindly introduce us to you and what you do and why you do it?
It would be my pleasure. So, hello everybody. My name is Claire Houston and I am a CBT therapist and mental health nurse. And I've been specialising in eating disorders for just over 10 years or so. And what I've seen over this time as well is eating disorders becoming much more prevalent. People are starting to seek more help. And I always say as well, Becky, we always take those statistics with a bit of a pinch of salt because it's drop in the ocean. And I think certainly as we're kind of going through the COVID situation, moving forward from there, we are seeing a huge spike in people needing help, accessing help and looking where to turn. So I think there's never been a better time than now to start talking about eating disorders.
I couldn't agree more. And we have the same in general practice. We've had a lot of problems that have amplified exponentially, quietly, maliciously behind COVID, because COVID has not been the only problem. I totally agree. So when we think about eating disorders, we tend to think about eating and food.
Yes.
And we shouldn't really, but it's difficult to unpick the food from the eating disorder. And when I look at some of the statistics, the brilliant charity you work for, BEAT, when they talk about anorexia nervosa having the highest death rate of any mental illness, I don't think we really realise to what extent it is a mental illness. Do you find that in your work that it's misunderstood and it becomes all about food?
Yes, absolutely. And I think separating food from the eating disorder as well, it's really important that, yes, we can't truly recover from an eating disorder without talking about food. But what we find is that for a lot of people, that the focus is all about food. So we go to the GPs and we're talking about weight and food, how much you're eating. You get referred to a dietitian. We talk about food and weight and how much you're eating and so on and so forth. But I think there's so much focus on the physical health of eating disorders that often we forget that it is such a huge mental health difficulty, and primarily it's not about food, it's not about weight and looking at the underlying issues, that these are the ways that we use food and weight to cope with whatever it is that's underlying.
Yeah, and those coping, or dare I say it, controlling mechanisms, I mean, they're picked up as doctors. We use the King's College guidance and the NICE guidance. Brilliant. And they even talk about deceit, for want of a better word, in anorexia nervosa in particular, around how they hide from us how little they're eating. And it does create a kind of judgment of them, which I think is quite unfair. And how would you educate people around understanding why people with eating disorders would deceive? What is going on there?
I think trying to put a new perspective in this and starting to think compassionately for that other person, and we start to question why might it be that somebody gets dragged along to their GP maybe to talk about their weight, to talk about food, and they might try and conceal it. There can be lots of different reasons why, but mostly it's because they are frightened. I like to describe it a lot of thinking about, I'm a Celebrity is on TV at the moment, isn't it? And you get these Bush Tucker trials and you've got to eat these witchy grubs and all these gross things. We define anorexia as being an intense fear of gaining or maintaining weight. So when we get somebody that's attending the GP for the first time to talk about their weight and to talk about food and concerns that we have, ultimately we're getting them to face their biggest fear, which is the thought that somebody's going to turn around to them and say, you need to gain weight and you need to eat more. So when we start to put that kind of perspective onto things, it makes it no wonder really that people start to feel so frightened. And when we start to think about the way, not to go too in depth about kind of medicalizing things too much, but the effects of starvation on the brain means that people cannot think straight when it comes to making decisions about their health properly at that stage. So what can happen often is that we've got very kind of difficult thoughts that are reinforcing that people just want to make them gain weight. They want to get them fat. They will often think that this is not a problem, that they're absolutely fine and everyone's just making a big deal out of everything. What we're not seeing there as well is intense experiences of anxiety, very low mood, constant negative thoughts that kind of echo and swim round. And the way to quieten the eating disorder is to not eat. So often then, if we then start to say, you've got to go see the GP or you've got to go to the eating disorder service, etc., and we start to talk about that food, they will do anything to try and avoid that intense feeling of, I'm out of control, something bad's going to happen. And it's feeling almost as if other people are suddenly getting control of your life, and it feels extremely terrifying. So even though for some people they may not want to be underweight, they may want help for their eating disorder, they will still be scared of what this means once we trigger this process.
It is quite important, though. I know we're trying to demedicalize because we're trying to think in a more kind of spiritual and compassionate sense, which is important. But I do think that medicalizing it can sometimes lift some blame, because if you're saying to them, look, it's nothing you've done wrong. If you starve a brain, you will start to get intrusive thoughts, irrational thoughts, big feelings you can't control. Do you find with your therapy that helps boys and girls feel less accountable for these thoughts? Because sometimes I think what we experience in general practice is that families can feel a fury that they're somehow creating this or perpetuating this. But actually, if you showed them what a starved brain will do, like the Minnesota experiment, tell us about that, because I'm really fascinated about that.
Wonderful. I'm so glad you brought that up. It's one of my favorite subjects to talk about, because I literally had a client this week as well, Becky. So just a few days ago, I'll use her as a little example. So this is a young woman, in high school, had a whole year of parents getting quite cross, getting quite frustrated, going, well, why is it that she just can't eat? And feeling completely out of control. And this poor young person, she sat in front of me and she says, I don't want to be like this. I want to go out with my friends. I hate that I'm so skinny. I hate the way that I feel, but I can't do this. Why? Why is it that this is such a struggle? And this is only session 3 or 4 that we've spent together. And during that time, we've started to talk about the effects of the brain, of starvation, looking at some of that kind of psychoeducation about what happens to people once an eating disorder starts to take hold. So we use the Minnesota study as a way to highlight to people that, in a nutshell, it's not their fault, and it is simple biology that starts to take over. So to describe the Minnesota study to my clients, the way that I describe that is that it was a group of men during the war that were conscientious objectors. They were all gathered together and they all were put onto a low-calorie diet in order to look at the effects of prisoners of war returning, because they said, why is it that once these prisoners of war return back home and they start to eat, why is it that they started to die? So they were looking at the effects of refeeding syndrome. And actually what they found by doing this experiment was that it was not just refeeding syndrome that they're looking at. They were looking at the effects of starvation in itself. And these groups of men, they were just regular men aged between, I think the youngest was around 20 and they were going up to about their 50s. And they were prescribed these diets. They were getting on with their lives. And what they started to notice is they started to mimic the exact same behaviors as people with anorexia in particular. They started to pull apart their food, eating in tiny little dots, and they would push their food out to the sides. They'd take a long time to eat. They would do excessive exercise, so like pacing up and down. They do lots of leg shaking, and they'd be thinking about food nonstop and trying to kind of occupy their thoughts doing other things. There's even one example of one of the men. He started to live with these two old spinsters, and he would go and chop their wood for them every day. And he'd spend about 8 hours a day chopping wood. Eventually, he was driven so kind of mad with these thoughts about food, about his body, about everything. I always say, I apologize for this. I can never remember if it was his finger or his hand, but he ended up chopping one of those off in order to kind of quieten those voices down in his head.
Now, so a form of self-harm almost.
Absolutely. It was just like he was driven so mad by this. And these are, I hate to say it, but these are men. They're not typically how we would think about a typical eating disorder presentation coming through. These are just regular men, no body image issues beforehand. They weren't treated for anorexia beforehand, just regular guys. But look at how the effects of starvation affected their mental health. Now, one of the best things I like to do here, Becky, as well, is I always go like, right, okay, how many calories do you think that they were restricted to every day?
Well, I know we're supposed to have more than 500 for basic brain function. Is that right, per day?
You're right.
How many were they restricted to? Was it quite astonishingly high? Is it higher than we would think?
Ooh,
Can I have a clue?
Of course. Well, in fact, I'll just say it, Becky. The men in this study were restricted to 2,000 calories a day.
No. So it is high. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Well, there you go. Yeah. Doesn't that speak volumes? It's the involuntary element. It's a bit like the kind of Dementors in Harry Potter, isn't it?
Yes, yeah.
And so hard to shake off. And that, I think, should offer basically a relief if help is coming, shouldn't it? Yes. Because the fundamentals of putting these patients back together again, well, the principles are to get in early, aren't they? And to spend time undoing these neural pathways that have started to self-destroy.
Absolutely.
Do you feel, I mean, that's a journey that can't be rushed, is it?
You're right. And depending on then the severity, how long the eating disorder has been gone on for, if there is a weight loss, for instance, weight restoration periods can very much vary. And as a general rule of thumb, we're looking at no more than 0.5 to a kilogram a week. So sometimes I may get parents that would come through and say, how long is this going to take? It's, we want to get back to normal. And I think that, like, first of all, highlighting that if there has been quite significant weight losses, it's going to take that amount of time plus more to be able to kind of not only start to physically get somebody well, but eating disorder treatment comes in kind of 3 phases as well. So it's kind of getting people fed again and going through repairing some of the damage to the body and to the brain. The next stage is kind of like getting people steady and working on challenging those thoughts and being able to manage a meal plan and settle onto that. Then we kind of go into maintenance, but maintenance for some people, it may be that they are ready for it. They are like, I feel ready to go back into real life and feel kind of ready for the next set of challenges. But for other people, the period of maintenance and being able to come to terms with maintaining their weight, getting their confidence around that, and perhaps again fixing some of those thought processes that led to that vulnerability where an eating disorder was possible, that can take significant amounts of time as well. So I think looking at the entire process with people, it's not something that we snap back from. It's not something that you can decide tomorrow I'm going to recover and it just works like that. Recovery is not linear. It's one of the many phrases that we'll use throughout treatment to say there'll be good days, bad days, and everything in between. But it's a slow and steady process that is teaching somebody basically from scratch to feed themselves, to manage their sleep, looking at how we manage hobbies, interests, going back to school or work or college, university, wherever they may be. It's helping them to look at their own self-esteem, fixing any body dysmorphic thoughts and body image, for instance. It's looking at confidence, assertive skills, managing depression. It's such a complex illness that, again, if we just focus on the food, we can feed somebody, but they're not going to be able to sustain a long-lasting recovery if that's the only thing that we focus on.
Well, I mean, that's just so important, isn't it? It's just not about the food. And yes, you can feed somebody, you can feed anybody. You can section seriously ill anorexics under the Mental Health Act for refeeding, but what are they going to do when they leave? It's in the NICE guidance, it talks about a minimum of 40 weeks of CBT for anorexics, doesn't it? So this is the long haul. And I think what we find is, this is a subject very close to my heart as well, is that it builds up so much frustration and pain that people want the snap out of it because they're desperate for a release, aren't they? Not just the patient, everyone around them. How, if a child or adult aren't ready, so you need to be mentally ready to accept the problem and to embrace change and help. What would your tips be to get people into that kind of motivated part of the cycle?
Good question. And I think ideally speaking as well, it let's presume that this person is able to make that change. So I just want to highlight that for some people, it does have to be that kind of hospital route if somebody is very, very unwell and if they are unable to engage in kind of outpatient treatment or therapies, etc. It may be that no matter what we do to motivate somebody, it might be that they require that inpatient style. And again, it's getting the brain and the body fed in order to be able to do some of that work. So that is a portion of the population that we're talking about, but the highest proportion of people will not want to have the help at first to begin with, and we have to lay that kind of groundwork, and this will be the majority of people coming through our doors. And what we do in order to kind of motivate people is, I always say there's nothing quite like speaking to somebody that doesn't know very much about eating disorders and go, just get them to eat, just tell them to eat. And I go, oh yeah, I've not thought about that. Well, thank you.
Oh, okay. Wow, that's novel.
Yeah. So it's very much like seeing, for anyone that's a smoker, for instance, when you see the side of the packet of cigarettes and it's got pictures of the people with their teeth falling out and all this kind of stuff. What I think we have a lot of focus on is talking about the consequences of an eating disorder. If you don't get better, then you'll have this happen, you'll have that happen, this will happen to you. And the thing is that often those things don't work, and it doesn't work because it feels a million miles away. It might be that they feel quite in denial themselves that I'm not sick, so why would that happen to me? Or that only happens to people that are really skinny. And then even if they are really underweight, they still might not connect. So, we could have people very, very low weight and still think that they are perfectly fine and there's nothing wrong with them. So ways that we kind of engage people with that is actually making sure that they feel in control of this. So I will do psychoeducation with people and talking about the consequences of the eating disorder, but less so thinking about you'll never have children if you don't get your fertility back on and this, that, and the other. That can be a motivating factor for some people, but not for everybody. What we do say, in fact, is saying, in what ways does your eating disorder or problem with eating or whatever it is that you're going to use how does this make life difficult at the moment? What would you like to see happen? So actually coming alongside somebody from where they are now and helping them see and navigate this space to say, right, I noticed, I feel like I'm in a bit of a mess at the moment. I feel that everything's out of control. I feel that I don't know where to turn to next. We actually then start to map out and say, okay, you might not want to change this, but what would you like to change? How can we help you start to see that this bit is important? And being able to then say, how do we show other people that this part is important? And I think that actually giving people that level of respect and humanizing people again, because I think it does feel completely out of control that once the cat's out of the bag, it never goes back in. And people being able to feel that you're on their side, that nothing's going to happen to them. It's more that you're going to walk through those doors together. We're going to go through this together. How can I help you take those next brave steps? And I think that empowering somebody to feel in control of that, so you're not just a passenger to it, is so vital in moving forward.
It's so vital, and the respect thing is key, isn't it? Because what we find with our mental illness patients, they're all shapes and sizes, genders, sexes, but actually there's a common trait that they're often very intelligent academically and emotionally intelligent. So they're absorbing everything, and it's wounding and hurting. So working with their intelligence in creating a structure and something they can control, do you think that is a key to the success? Because you read about eating disorders and they are often high achievers. They talk about often anorexic patients are perfectionists. How important is it to level with them there? Because I suppose it's important they never feel patronized for a start.
Absolutely. And I think that, perfectionism and eating disorders go hand in hand. So does kind of any kind of ASD presentation, anxiety, depression. All of these things are really super common in eating disorders, and they're kind of, your vulnerabilities to being able to getting an eating disorder. And then what happens is actually helping them to understand as well some of the tools and the tricks to be able to manage those perfectionist traits, to be able to manage anxiety properly. Again, it not only just empowers them in their recovery from their eating disorder, but helps to make life feel more manageable. So again, it's giving that control back, because one of the favorite phrases that I use is to say that, like, we do the best that we can with the resources that we've got. And again, if we think about the way that we use food and we use weight and we use shape, is that if we feel completely out of control, depressed, anxious, whatever's going on for us in our lives, people generally just don't care. They'll smile, they'll nod, they'll go, oh, sucks, good luck with that. Or have you tried not being sad? Have you tried not being anxious, etc. But the second
the dreaded sympathy.
Yes, exactly. And it's like we use our body often as kind of ways to demonstrate how we're feeling. And actually, if you suddenly gained or lost weight, that says I'm not okay. And people start to take notice a little bit more. So it's not attention seeking. I want to make that very, very clear. But it is our natural communication tool. Another example there, Becky, that I like to give is that what power do we have when we feel that we've got no power? And ultimately, throughout history, suffragettes, if you weren't listening to what we wanted, we will starve ourselves and then you'll be forced to listen. Kings, queens, anyone throughout history, if you cannot listen to what I have to say, I will starve myself until you listen to me. And that can often be a way of using our body and our eating disorder to communicate, I am not okay. They're not doing it on purpose. It's our natural response that we have that in our DNA to say, if I'm not happy with something and something's going on, food is the tool to be able to demonstrate that.
And that fundamental food is life is why parents, carers, friends go into a panic, because they don't want their loved one to starve to death. It is very powerful, isn't it? We are talking in December, And a lot of eating disorder anxiety stems around meal times, doesn't it? And social events involving food. What would be your advice? What are the tricks and tools to use? Not focusing too much on outcomes, like you say, more listening and realizing and getting through the day. What would be your tricks and tools to get through this festive period of food everywhere?
Well, for anyone that is struggling with an eating disorder or having a loved one that's struggling with an eating disorder, again, if you go onto the BEAT website, we've got a fantastic new service that's just been launched. It's called Pod, and it's got an entire section dedicated to coping with Christmas. And I myself am going to be delivering one of the parent groups as well for carers in supporting people with eating disorders over the Christmas period. Because you're absolutely right. We use food to celebrate, we use food to commiserate. It's part of our culture, and this is a very, very, very difficult time of year for many people with eating disorders, be it that you're having to sit down and eat when you're really not in that kind of place, or to have an abundance of food and feel very overwhelmed. Perhaps there's problems with binging, for instance, and actually starting to navigate around this space. The best advice I can always give people is give ourselves realistic goals and boundaries and agree that with everybody that's around us at that time. So for some people, it might be that we can sit down and we can have a normal Christmas dinner and we can process that and say, right, where would you like to sit at the table? How can we make this feel less anxiety provoking for you? Perhaps could we play a game? Could we talk things through? Would you just like to be called when it's time to sit and eat, or would you like to set the table? Finding out how they feel in control without being over controlled. So another tip that I would say is for many people is to try and stay out the kitchen. I know that's going to be very anxiety provoking, but I promise you it'll be more anxiety provoking watching somebody cook and trying to control that process and feeling anxious about that, rather than out of sight. Change your focus of attention, let those thoughts go, and focus intensely on something else instead. Use your distraction techniques. Looking as well for those people that they do struggle with perhaps binging, or if you're worried about the abundance of food, again, talking to people that are close to you to be able to set something up so that you feel that you can be connected with other people, that we can feel safe around food. And ultimately, if you don't ask, you won't get. What we often feel is that, we want people to be mind readers. And even if your family has been going through this for years with you, you're a different person every single day. And year on year, just because you did something certain last year does not mean that this would be the same this year. And hopefully, fingers crossed, will be different again next Christmas as well.
I love that outlook that things change, because, we have millions of thoughts in a day, don't we? People change, feelings change from hour to hour, minute to minute. So, that's a really positive thing, isn't it? Because you look forward rather than backward. The big feelings, like you were saying before, managing the big feelings around eating disorders. If you learn to do that, you can manage them in life. BEAT talks a lot about the big feelings. Can you tell us about the big feeling cycle? Why that works?
So ultimately, to kind of simplify some of our formulations, looking through the big feeling, it's saying that something sparks off in somebody, and it can be literally anything. It can be suddenly a feeling of guilt or a feeling of shame. It could be a feeling of anxiety, of low mood, but these feelings feel very, very overly intensified. And again, if we look at the kind of the effects of starvation, is that does enhance the way that we feel. It's our primitive kind of trigger to go off and find food. And just because somebody has an eating disorder, those primitive switches don't get switched off. They're there. So we're thinking about food, we're worried about food, we're then also having these adjacent feelings that might be guilt or anxiety or shame or whatever it is. And then what happens is that we start to worry about what happens next. We start to focus that on our food, on our shape, on our weight. We'll try to do something to make this feeling go away, because nobody likes to feel uncomfortable. So what happens there is that we start to do these kind of safety behaviors. So it might be that if I feel really focused and I don't eat, then I'm going to feel so much better, because that shame, that guilt, that worry is going to be replaced by pride or achievement. So we get this kind of like temporary relief, but then what happens then is that like that's not sustainable. That little hit of dopamine doesn't last very long. We're still hungry. We still have that big feeling. It starts to come back again. So we have to try harder and harder and harder to make that feeling go away. The goalpost starts to change, and we get stuck into this cycle then that the more starved that we get, or the more that we engage in the eating disorder behaviors, the more of the surface level gets kind of like skimmed over. But ultimately, we know underneath that that's rotting from the inside. So
it's a false reward, isn't it? Yeah. And speaking of false rewards, I can't talk to you, Claire, without mentioning the phones and social media, because they are the ultimate dopamine hit all day, every day. In your career, have you noticed an impact from social media? Has it been stark? Has it caused its own specific problems?
I think yes, definitely. The thing is with the phones and like going on social media, etc., is that eating disorders have always been around, and I think that there's been documented eating disorders way back into kind of classical eras. But looking at the way that these social media tools have enhanced and intensified an experience of an eating disorder are absolutely unbeknown at this stage, but it's hugely impactful. When I first started working in this field, we had Facebook to begin with, and then ultimately in came Instagram. Now we've got TikTok, and it's not that these tools are harmful on their own. It's the way that people use them. They will always be used by people that want to exploit people's vulnerabilities or find like-minded people. So away from those kind of social media aspects, we also have things like Reddit and subreddits and all these kind of like, 4chans and all these other kind of pro-anorexia websites.
4chan, what's that?
Oh, it's another one of those little like message boards almost, and it's always been known to be a little bit more underground. So Reddit tends to be one of the ones that most people will be familiar with. But things like 4chan, this is where we're starting to get into much more harmful and unvetted information. So there will always, and there always have been people that would post things online. But however, nowadays, so for instance, I've worked with a young woman very recently as well, that she watches lots of these what I eat in a day TikToks, for instance, and she's looking at what I'm telling her to eat or what we're collaborating on and going, but nobody else eats this. And then you look through this kind of process and you go, this is what we're eating is normally, we're promoting normal eating. And what they end up doing is that once you kind of get picked up by the algorithm, it completely pushes you down this rabbit hole.
Yeah, it sends you the content, doesn't it? It's lethal.
The more you engage in it, the more you'll get it seen. And even the makers of Instagram have recognized how their platform has contributed massively to the perpetuation of eating disorders.
Well, rock on the online harms bill next year. It couldn't come soon enough. Do you have any advice for young people? Because we know that eating disorders we're most at risk of developing eating disorders in our teens, aren't we? 13 to 17, is that right? So do you have any advice for young people around hazardous social media use?
Absolutely. And I think that, it's never been more important now than ever before to say we need to be very, very, very careful of the kinds of things that we surround ourselves with. So I like to say, if you want to be healthy, it's not about the foods that we eat or the exercises that we do, it's the environments that we surround ourselves in. And if you're then trying to be healthy, which is often how an eating disorder may start, thinking, I want to take care of myself a little bit better, this is poison. And actually noticing there that, if you're going down this path, if you start to see things that make you feel uncomfortable or that they spark this interest in you about going down diets and foods and exercise and body image comparisons, etc., this is some of your first warning signs that maybe this is not the path that you want to go down. I totally recommend blocking anything that comes up when you're scrolling through TikTok or Instagram or whatever. Report it or just puts down that you don't want to see this, because honestly, this person that I was talking about just then, she's literally said, like, I watched like 2 videos and now that's the only thing that comes on my feed. And even myself, you know, when I use these platforms myself, and like I still will every so often get something coming through about body image, about dieting, about exercise, etc. And I'm just here to watch some funny videos, you know. I want to see pictures of dogs, you know.
No, you can have great enjoyment, but there's such great risk of harm at the same time, which makes me think it should be scrapped. But that's just me being a fuddy-duddy, you know, about the whole thing. We haven't talked a lot about other sorts of eating disorders. So just before we finish up, I think that's really important, or about the boys. I mean, I hope we have included them in all forms through the discussion, but just to say it as well out loud, because I think people forget the boys.
Yes, absolutely. And I think actually talking about breaking the stigma around eating disorders and opening this conversation up is that actually we need to really challenge who it is that we think have eating disorders. So ultimately, along those statistics, is that we think that anorexia is kind of lurking around every corner, that this is the biggest eating disorder, and in fact, it's not. It's the rarest of all the eating disorders. However, it's more prevalent in young people. So for teenagers, anorexia will be more prevalent, but for anyone aged 18 and above, you're more likely to see things like bulimia, binge eating disorder, other things that are called OSFED, which is other types of eating disorders that don't quite fit into those boxes. And that includes things like ARFID, which is avoidant restrictive intake disorder, where people have a fear of being sick, or they have a fear of being unwell from food, etc. And therefore they have quite a limited diet, but no body image issues. Or we have people that are restrictive, but they are taking in enough calories perhaps. Or we have people that maybe have night eating syndrome, people that are eating non-food items, all sorts, you name it. That's where the kind of OSFED button comes in. But what we find when it comes to looking at the bigger picture, so yes, statistically speaking, young people, teenagers, especially girls, they will be more likely to get anorexia, the rarest eating disorder. But when we actually look at the other eating disorders, especially in things like binge eating disorder, the statistics are 50-50. Men are just as likely to have binge eating disorder as women. And it's a 49-51% split pretty much. Right. So we then start to say, not only are we ignoring men in the discussions around eating disorders at times, men don't get that same question when we start to ask, you know, what's going on with weight? How are we feeling about food? What's going on with these underlying issues? And they are huge, forgotten about demographic. We need to be addressing men and boys in our conversations constantly, as well as looking at other diversity demographics as well. It's not just a white young woman's problem. Eating disorders exist in every kind of community, and there's some great information out there. And there's a book that I forget the title of just now, but I'll pass it over to you, Becky, so that you can put this on your podcast info. Talking about Black women's experiences of eating disorders, looking at it more from a BAME point of view. So yeah, I think we need to take off that we have to be young, we have to be white, we have to be thin to have an eating disorder, and say actually anybody could have an eating disorder, and let's start opening our eyes to that and looking at redesigning the system and how we can address eating disorders for all.
I think that's a wonderful place to finish on, Claire. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I feel I could talk to you all day about this subject. But thanks again. And any information that you can offer us to go with the podcast would be fantastic.
Absolutely.
We'll put it hand in hand. Okay.
Thank you so much, Becky. Take care.
You too.
For anyone who is interested or would like more information on eating disorders, please visit the BEAT website, in particular during this festive season when BEAT is offering an increased level of specialist help, support and advice at Christmas for sufferers and their families who are worried about how they will cope. Thank you so much for listening to my brand new podcast. Please find each one uploaded to the You Before Two website. And if you'd like to share your story or expertise with our followers, don't hesitate to contact us at info@youbefore2.co.uk.